Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that in the middle of a fiercely negotiated trade truce, intended to level the playing field, the adversary's profits didn't just grow, they shattered every record in human history? And ask yourself this: when one nation hits a $1 trillion profit while the other sees its exports collapse by nearly a third, who is actually writing the rules of the new global order? Today, we are looking at a tectonic shift in the global economy, a moment that future historians may well cite as the definitive end of the post-Cold War unipolar era. The headlines are dominated by a single, staggering figure: China has achieved a trade surplus exceeding $1 trillion. But the headline hides a far more devastating reality for the United States. While Beijing is accumulating wealth at a pace never before seen, U.S. exports to China have not just dipped. They have collapsed by 29% in a single month. This divergence, a record surplus for China and a record collapse for American influence, is not a statistical anomaly. It is the result of a fundamental misunderstanding of economic warfare, a failed strategy of containment, and a ruthless, successful pivot by China to dominate the global south and high-tech manufacturing. To understand why this is happening, we must look beyond the daily stock tickers and understand the structural dismantling of American economic leverage. Before we dive deeper into the mechanics of this shift, I want to hear your take. Do you believe this $1 trillion surplus signals the irreversible end of American dominance? Or can the US turn this round? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. To truly grasp the magnitude of this moment, we must first examine the historic data that marks a divergence of fortunes between these two superpowers. We need to let the numbers settle in. China's customs agency and global financial monitors have confirmed that the nation's trade surplus has surged past the $1 trillion mark. To put this in perspective, this is not merely a good year for Chinese exporters. It is the largest accumulation of trade wealth by any single nation in the history of global commerce. This figure becomes even more daunting when we consider the environment in which it was achieved. This did not happen during an era of open borders and free trade optimism. It happened precisely when the United States had erected its highest barriers in nearly a century, despite tariffs that, in some sectors, reached averages of 475%. And despite a bipartisan consensus in Washington dedicated to slowing China's rise, Beijing's export machine did not slow down. It accelerated. The surplus is now hovering around 10% of China's entire GDP. For historical comparison, even at the height of America's industrial might during World War II, when the U.S. was the arsenal of democracy supplying the entire Allied war effort, its trade surplus in manufactured goods peaked at around 6% of GDP. China has now nearly doubled that relative dominance in peacetime. On the other side of the Pacific, the data paints a picture of catastrophic decline. In November alone, U.S. exports to China collapsed by 29%. This creates a harrowing split-screen reality. China is selling more to the world than ever before, while buying significantly less from the United States. This 29% collapse occurred during what was politically framed as a trade truce, a period where negotiations were supposed to be stabilizing the relationship. Instead, the data reveals that the decoupling is real, but it is one-sided. China is successfully decoupling from its reliance on American products, while the world is becoming more, not less, addicted to Chinese manufacturing. The collapse signifies more than just lost revenue. It represents a loss of strategic market access for American agriculture, industry, and technology that may never be recovered. This catastrophe invites a harsh audit of American foreign policy over the last decade. revealing the failure of U.S. economic warfare and a phenomenon we might call the containment paradox. The prevailing belief in Washington was that tariffs and economic pressure would force Beijing into submission, compelling it to open its markets and play by Western rules. The data proves this was a strategic hallucination. We are witnessing the paradox where the harder the U.S. pushed to contain China economically, the more resilient and independent China became. The first failure lies in the mechanism of the tariffs themselves. Every major economic study conducted since the onset of the trade war confirms that the cost of these tariffs was not borne by Chinese exporters, but by American consumers and businesses. Tariffs functioned effectively as a tax on the American public, driving up inflation and input costs for U.S. manufacturers, making them less competitive globally. Washington believed it could starve China of revenue. Instead, it squeezed American wallets. Furthermore, the U.S. underestimated the irreversibility of market loss. Economics is not a light switch. You cannot turn trade flows off and on at will. When Washington weaponized agricultural exports, threatening to cut off China's supply of soybeans and corn, Beijing did not fold. It simply picked up the phone and called Brazil, Argentina, and Russia. Today, Brazil has largely replaced the United States as China's primary agricultural partner. That market share is gone. It is a permanent structural shift. American farmers, once the breadbasket of the Pacific trade, have been relegated to the sidelines, kept afloat not by trade profits but by government intervention. The fact that the U.S. government had to authorize over $12 billion in bailouts to farmers proves that the policy created a domestic crisis rather than solving an international one. A strategy that requires you to bail out your own foundational industries is, by definition, a failed strategy. Ultimately, the U.S. discovered a hard truth about the modern world. You cannot fight an industrial war with tweets and threats when you have spent 30 years outsourcing your industrial base. Washington assumed that because it held the financial keys, the dollar, it could dictate terms. But real power lies in production. You cannot rebuild factories with rhetoric, while the U.S. focused on the financialization of its economy. China focused on the physicalization of those building the factories, the ports, and the supply chains. The 29% collapse in U.S. exports is the receipt for decades of industrial negligence. While Washington was playing checkers with tariffs, Beijing was playing a complex game of Go, executing a strategic pivot defined by offensive adaptation. Realizing that the American market was becoming hostile and unreliable, China did not wait to be suffocated. Instead, it aggressively diversified, pivoting its economic engine toward the global south, Europe, and its own backyard in Asia. The data shows a massive redirection of trade flows. While exports to the U.S. plummeted, Chinese shipments to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations (ASEAN) and the European Union surged up 15% and 8% respectively in key sectors. In fact, ASEAN has now eclipsed the United States and the EU to become China's largest trading partner. This is not accidental. It is the dividend of the Belt and Road Initiative. For a decade, Western analysts mocked the BRI as wasteful spending. Today, we see it for what it truly is, the infrastructure of a post-American trading order, by building ports, railways, and digital networks across 140 nations. China created a captive economic orbit. These nations, indebted to and integrated with Chinese infrastructure, became the natural recipients of the goods that were once destined for American shelves. This pivot creates a formidable tariff-free backdoor. Chinese components are now shipped to Vietnam, Mexico, or Thailand, lightly processed, and then re-exported to the West. But more importantly, China is building an economy that can survive without the American consumer by deepening ties. With Latin America for resources and Africa for growing consumer markets, Beijing has insulated itself. The Great Pivot means that China has successfully reduced its dependence on American markets from 20% of its total exports to under 15%, a figure that continues to fall annually. This adaptation was fueled by necessity. The trade war forced Chinese companies to become battle-hardened, cut off from certain U.S. technologies. They were forced to innovate. Denied access to U.S. customers, they were forced to find new ones. The result is a Chinese economy that is far more diversified and geoeconomically robust than it was before the trade war began. Washington intended to isolate China. Instead, it inadvertently forced China to globalize on its own terms, bypassing the U.S. centrality that defined the last century. How exactly did China achieve a $1 trillion surplus while the rest of the world slowed down? The answer lies in the mechanics of dominance. Built upon a strategy of power trading and industrial supremacy, the United States engages in capitalism. China engages in power trading. In the Western model, trade is conducted primarily for profit. In the Chinese model, trade is an instrument of national power, used to degrade adversaries, hollow out competitors, and secure strategic leverage. China has mastered the art of import substitution. For decades, China was the world's factory, but it assembled parts made elsewhere. It imported high-tech components from Japan, South Korea, and the US, assembled them and shipped them out. That era is over. Today, China is aggressively substituting those imports with domestically produced alternatives. It is making its own petrochemicals, its own machinery, and increasingly, its own legacy chips. This explains the widening surplus. China is selling more, but buying much less. The supply chain has been internalized. This internalization is powered by state subsidies on a scale that Western private enterprise cannot match. Take the screen industry, for example. Companies like Bow Technology, which now dominates the global LCD market, receive state subsidies that in some years exceeded their total net profits. This allows Chinese firms to sell at rock-bottom prices, driving competitors out of business and capturing 72% of the global market. Once the competition is gone, China controls the supply chain. This pattern is being repeated in steel, solar panels, and now, electric vehicles, EVs. Furthermore, Beijing manages its currency, the yuan, with strategic precision. Unlike Western nations that often favor strong currencies to boost consumer buying power, China has kept the yuan relatively weak. This keeps Chinese exports artificially cheap. Acting as a massive subsidy to foreign buyers, it allows Chinese goods to flood global markets, undercutting local production in India, Brazil, and Europe. The result is absolute industrial supremacy. China now accounts for roughly 1/3 of all global manufacturing. To understand the scale of this dominance, consider that China produces more than the United States, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Britain combined in critical sectors of the future green energy, batteries, EVs. And shipbuilding. China is not just leading, it is approaching monopoly status. This is not merely about making cheap toys anymore. It is about dominating the foundational technologies of the 21st century. However, we must also acknowledge the internal driver of this surplus: weak domestic demand and the export of deflation. A significant reason for the $1 trillion imbalance is that the Chinese domestic economy is sick. The Chinese consumer is not spending enough to absorb the colossal output of Chinese factories. A popping real estate bubble and demographic decline have led to low domestic confidence and high savings rates because domestic demand is weak. China faces a crisis of overcapacity. It has built factories capable of supplying the entire world. And to keep those factories humming and workers employed, it must export. This necessity turns the trade surplus into a weapon of deflation export. China is flooding the world with goods priced far below the cost of production elsewhere, while this benefits consumers in the short term through lower prices. It threatens the industrial viability of other nations. This is why we see a backlash forming not just in the US, but in the global South. Countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, and Thailand are realizing they are becoming trade colonies. They export raw materials, iron ore, soybeans, lithium to China, and buy back finished manufactured goods, killing their own domestic industries in the process. We are seeing countries that were once friendly to Chinese trade starting to erect their own barriers, fearing that their economies will be hollowed out by this tsunami of Chinese production. The $1 trillion surplus is, in this sense, a measurement of global imbalance that threatens to destabilize not just the West, but the developing world as well. To fully understand why this $1 trillion figure is a tombstone for the old economic order, we must also dismantle a comforting myth that has lulled Western policymakers into complacency for decades. The idea that the United States could remain the world's brain while outsourcing the muscle to China. This California model design here, assembled there, was predicated on the arrogance that manufacturing is a low-value commodity, distinct from the high-value magic of innovation. The current trade data reveals that this distinction is not just false. It is fatal. The assumption was that China would forever remain the assembly line, tightening the screws on iPhones designed in Cupertino, while the US retained the intellectual property and the lion's share of the profits. But innovation is not a lightning bolt that strikes in a vacuum. It is an iterative process that happens on the factory floor. When you outsource the doing, you eventually lose the knowing. This is the phenomenon of the industrial commons. By allowing the migration of entire supply chains to China, from batteries to rare earth processing to photovoltaics, the United States surrendered the ecosystem where innovation actually occurs today. China's $1 trillion surplus is not composed merely of cheap textiles and plastic toys. It is increasingly driven by advanced machinery, electric vehicles, and sophisticated electronics. China is no longer just assembling, it is engineering. We see this clearly in the failure of the tech war. When Washington imposed sweeping semiconductor sanctions, the goal was to freeze China's technological development in 2020. It was a strategy based on the belief that China could not innovate without American permission. The result is Sputnik moment for Beijing. Huawei's release of the Mate 60 Pro, powered by a sophisticated 7-nanometer chip manufactured domestically by SMIC despite the sanctions, proved that the containment wall had failed. The sanctions did not stop China. They merely forced China to build a parallel, sanction-proof technology stack. Now, instead of buying chips from Qualcomm or Intel contributing to US exports, Chinese companies are buying from local suppliers. This structural shift explains why US exports are collapsing while China's surplus grows. The US forced China to learn how to make the one thing it used to buy. This technological independence has terrified the Western auto industry. The dominance of Chinese EVs, led by companies like BYD, is not a result of stolen IP, but of superior scaling and battery innovation. While US automakers paused their plans due to profitability concerns, China pushed forward, achieving a scale that allows them to produce high-tech vehicles at a price point no Western company could match. This is the innovation myth shattered. You cannot win the future of technology if you have forgotten how to build things. The $1 trillion surplus is the financial manifestation of this reality. China has moved up the value chain, and the US, having hollowed out its industrial core, finds itself unable to compete in the very sectors it once invented. The era of designing without building is over. The power now belongs to those who can do both. If you are finding this analysis helpful in understanding these complex geopolitical shifts, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to keep bringing you this kind of in-depth content. Finally, we must ask, what are the geopolitical implications of this shift? It is nothing less than the sound of power changing hands. We must return to the framework of political realism. Economic power is the foundation of military power. The nation that produces more eventually conquers more, if not territorially. Then strategically, a $1 trillion transfer of wealth is a $1 trillion transfer of strategic capacity. It funds the modernization of the People's Liberation Army, the expansion of the Chinese Navy, already the largest in the world by hull count, and the hardening of Chinese society against future sanctions, the collapse of US exports, and the rise of China's surplus signal the acceleration of a multipolar world. The dollar's dominance, while still significant, faces gradual erosion as China settles more trade in yuan with partners like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil. We are moving toward a world where the United States can no longer unilaterally dictate the rules of a global economy. The sanctions weapon is becoming duller by the day because China has built an alternative economic architecture that allows it and its partners to survive outside the US blast zone. Washington now faces a dilemma with no easy answers. It has three divergent paths. The first is escalation, doubling down on sanctions and tariffs, moving toward a total blockade. This risks a kinetic war and global economic depression. The second is reinvention, attempting to reindustrialize America, investing trillions to rebuild the manufacturing base that was lost. This is the most logical path, but it takes decades and requires a political unity that is currently non-existent. The third path is acceptance, acknowledging that the unipolar moment is over and learning to coexist with a peer competitor that is economically superior in manufacturing. The tragedy for the United States is that it still treats economics as politics, a realm of soundbites, elections, and short-term stock gains. China understands that economics is warfare. The $1 trillion surplus is not just a statistic for the business pages. It is the scoreboard of a conflict that America did not realize it was losing until it was too late. The question is no longer whether China can challenge American dominance. That question was answered on December 8th. The question now is whether the United States has the capacity to understand the magnitude of this defeat and the discipline to survive in a world it no longer commands. Thank you.